Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of the PinkUn Norwich City Podcast in association with Future Radio 107.8 FM. My name is Southwell, and join us this week are Canaries correspondents Paddy, Davitt and Seaman. As all of you, I'm sure, listening will be aware, on Thursday, obviously the death of Queen Elizabeth II was announced at the age of 96. It launched kind of the beginning of well-rehearsed operations all across the country in all areas, something obviously that 90% of the people in this country haven't seen in their lifetime, the changing of a monarch and one passing away. So it's obviously had repercussions, and some of that has reached football, despite government advice stating that sporting events could continue this weekend, some of which have. The test match has taken place. There's plenty of rugby going on. The Premier League, EFL and the FA elected to postpone this weekend's matches as a mark of respect to this country's longest reigning monarch. That include, obviously, Norwich City's scheduled trip to Burnley in the Championship on Friday night. It was called off hours after, of course, the Palace's statement. And in spite of the lack of football, Norwich City or otherwise, we thought we would sit down and reflect on a week that will be remembered in the history books probably for all of time, which is a really quite surreal statement to say, and especially when you consider everything that's gone on in the last couple of years with a global pandemic, the first one of those in 100 years, various other events. I mean, Paddy, this has been quite surreal at times. We had the press conference with Dean Smith as usual on Thursday. Obviously, events escalated after that. It's just been take away the football from a purely sort of human being and living in this country aspect of it. It's been one of those things that's been talked about and mentioned for so long without actually happening. Now it's happening, and it still feels very surreal, all of the stuff that's happened in the last 48 hours or so.
Yeah, it's not a bad way to describe it. It is surreal. I don't recall in the previous 505 episodes talking about matters of a royal nature before, so that's pretty unusual. If you want to bring it right round to what we do for a living and what this platform is all about, but and it is. I mean, funny enough, I don't want to embarrass Sam or whatever, but we were having a discussion on Friday, I think it was, about on the night when the news, just about 6:30, wasn't it, Thursday evening, when that sad news was delivered officially. And I was sort of saying, how much of it, the coverage thereafter, did you watch? I don't think Sam, without wanting to speak for him, watched too much of the coverage, we'll put it like that. But whereas myself, my wife, we kind of put our toddler to bed, and then it was a bit, for the duration, really, just that rolling news cycle, flicking through various news channels, and not because I'm particularly a royalist per se, but because it is, as has been already stated, plenty of places elsewhere, first time in all our lives that this event has unfolded, and is an event of some historical significance for this country. And you only have to look at the impact around the wider world as well. It is the only item of news for the majority of the globe at the present, and that's, that is an epic thing to talk about and to be part of in some small way, given it's in this little island of ours. So and of course football, like the parallel you drew with the pandemic, Connor, football is in these circumstances fairly insignificant and irrelevant, basically. And I just think it's it maybe brings home, whether you're pro-royal or anti-royal, just kind of, about decency and those sort of values that, maybe have got lost a little bit along the way in this 24/7 social media driven world we all live in now and inhabit, with some dark undercurrents a lot of the time, and some pretty troubling things going on around the world. That there was a woman who didn't ask to be thrust into that role. She was born into it and had to accept it, but the selfless manner she carried herself for those 70 years on the throne. And you only have to look at the affection and the outpouring of warmth towards her and her family subsequently. So, it is a unique event in our lives, and as was the pandemic. So it probably just feels like another episode in a period which we probably living through it won't really fully appreciate until maybe we're in our dotage and look back and see what a seismic chain of events these last few years have been. And given it was in the same week as our prime minister changed as well, it is quite quite a period to be part of. And I suppose within that, of course, the direct impact for the fans of Norwich City and us as reporters was a no trip to Burnley. But and I know we might touch on this debate now. I mean, there's a lot of people think that was the wrong call and that the game shouldn't have been postponed this coming weekend. I personally think that is a fitting mark of respect, but the fact that other sports have chosen to continue will clearly, look the people who've made those decisions in the EFL and the FA and the Premier League and the broadcasters, I'm sure, and maybe scrutinise those decisions. But for me personally, I don't have an issue with this weekend showing the mark of respect to, the former monarch. But what that means for the midweek games, Bristol City scheduled to be at Carrow this coming Wednesday, and then West Brom a week today as we record, Saturday week. Who knows? But I think I'll be less willing to support those games being called off. But of course, there might be factors out of the control of the footballing authorities. There's a lot to talk about the policing aspect of these two rounds of games coming up and the impact, given the funeral, I think, has now been confirmed for Monday week. That may have an impact onto next weekend's fixtures. So, we'll probably be talking about this for a few more days yet. But purely as an event, I don't think we've seen anything like it before in our lives and probably won't again.
No, it doesn't do much to kind of help the fact that the last few years have felt like a Netflix show, a little bit like a simulation at times. It feels like we're kind of watching stuff unfold on the television, which is impacting us in ways that probably we never really expected or imagined. It's one of those things that's been, as I said, spoken about for so long. And actually what I thought I'd do is kind of take you through a timeline of what I was doing on Thursday. I mean, I'm sure you boys had similarly interesting days and the way it unfolded, but I was actually on for the Dean Smith press conference, so day started as normal. It was actually a 10 o'clock one, which is an hour later than perhaps they tend to be, I would imagine, because of Norwich City's sort of travel plans to head up to the northwest. So it ended that at 10 o'clock. I got home. I was actually watching I think there was some parliamentary debate around the obviously the cost of living crisis and energy prices, and was watching that. And as it was kind of unfolding, you began to see the notes getting passed around, and then social media began to pick it up. And then we obviously had the initial statement at kind of midday. And that was then really interesting. I think throughout the afternoon, it then probably became slightly obvious the way it was heading in terms of the way that it was being presented and portrayed on the news channels. Obviously, before then, we got confirmation, sadly, at 6:30. Norwich's game was then postponed a couple of hours later. So it ended up being quite a long day for various reasons, and probably for reasons that we wouldn't have wanted. But there are back pages that will never appear on that Burnley game. I think there was a full PinkUn that did slip into the newspaper because of various print deadlines. But it was just a very interesting day to kind of watch unfold and how it unfolded and trying to respond to that. Sam, I mean, what's your last couple of days been like? Because this is, as we said, 90% of the country, essentially, unless you're over 70, really has experienced a different monarch. It's always been the Queen. What's it been like to you to kind of watch and experience this event, this historical event, and kind of all of the stuff around it as well?
Yeah, it's quite strange, really. It's one of those things where you almost build up the size of it in your own head whenever the discussion has come up previously, that it's going to be this enormous thing. And while it is, and it's obviously, as Paddy referenced, taken over our televisions and taken over the news cycle and everything, it feels quite surreal that it's actually happening. It feels, because we're not involved in it, obviously we're not part of the family, we're not part of any sort of protocol or anything involved in that. Just watching on something that is massive but you have no impact on is quite strange. I mean, even with our job, it's, as the sports team, there's all these sort of, everybody else in the company is basically the busiest they've been for years, sort of thing, and then we're on the outside probably having to produce less content than at any time in the year, really, because obviously the pages are taken up by that news and people want to read about it on the website. So it's been quite a surreal few days. Obviously some debate around the sort of footballing elements of it and whether things should be cancelled. So it's been an interesting few days in terms of how people have dealt with it, but obviously quite sad, and you have to feel for, there'll be a lot of people out there that are deeply affected by this, and you can understand why. So yeah, it's been quite strange, quite surreal, as you said, and it's like one major event that doesn't feel real after another at the moment. With the way that sort of politics is going and COVID-19 before that, and plenty of things going on in our lives. But I think we've just had to sort of focus on what we're doing, which, to be honest, is less than usual, and maybe helping out people, with our jobs that are more involved in it than we are.
Yeah, I took my dog for a walk actually a couple of hours after the announcement was made, and it's probably only the second time ever that I've kind of walked around and felt a real sort of quietness, a natural quietness throughout, and kind of walking past, and it was dark, and walking past various houses, and every single sort of one had a news channel on. It was very bizarre, very surreal. I'll use that word again, and how it unfolded. And obviously, naturally, because of what we do and what we talk about and what we cover, we'll shift the conversation to football. And I'm going to do that via a tweet from Norwich City legend Darren Huckabee. He tweeted this, would have been Friday as we look at it. We're recording this on Saturday evening. He tweeted, he's got 25,000 likes. I think Ben Stokes, England cricket captain, nonetheless, quote retweeted it as well. He said, what's people's thoughts on sporting events going ahead? Might get shot down for this, but in my opinion, I think they should go ahead. National anthem and armbands and crack on. Normal folk don't get time off, and it unites the country. And also, Pad, I think just to add to that, football, maybe beyond obviously what we saw with the pandemic, has kind of always been there as a little bit of escapism for people, irrespective of what's been going on in the world, various terrorist attacks, wars, maybe outside of this country, political matters, global matters, humanitarian crises, the various situations that people maybe look at and want to get away from. A football stadium has always been open on a Saturday, Sunday, at the weekend for people to go and escape from matters outside of kind of what's going on. I mean, you kind of spoke earlier that the uniqueness of this situation makes it quite interesting, but what are your thoughts on obviously the decision taken by the footballing governing bodies, and that's from all levels, Premier League all the way down to kind of kids Sunday football, to postpone all fixtures this weekend? Is that something that you feel, I mean, you kind of hinted earlier, is the right decision in the circumstances, or do you think that they probably should have waited a little bit longer to see how other sports reacted to this situation?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is we can all have our opinions. Hooks is right, in many respects. I wouldn't disagree with that view. I just happen to have a counter view. I just think for this weekend, and okay, you can talk about other sports, what they've done, but football is the national game. It is the national obsession in many regards. So I don't think football needs to necessarily peer over the fence and because cricket is doing this or rugby are doing that, then feel they should follow suit. And if they go in a different direction there, that is by definition the wrong way. There's no right or wrong in this scenario. People will feel differently, just in terms of how people have been affected. Sam was right. There will be people deeply affected by this. And, I've watched countless interviews now of people stood outside Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle or even Balmoral earlier today and talking about the former monarch in terms of like the nation's grandmother and feeling it was that she was somehow their grandmother, even though they never met her, was never in her orbit, but that was the impact she had on a lot of people. So much in the same way that millions of people will be experiencing this and living it and reliving it in various different ways and feeling that whole range of emotions. I think it's fair for people, if we bring it right back to should football have gone ahead this weekend, to have essentially diametrically opposed views, but doesn't mean one's right or one's wrong. It's essentially the situation is the governing bodies in discussions with DCMS, the government department. I'm sure Palace officials had input into that, and we know there was lots of discussions sort of probably started Thursday evening late, but carried on Friday. And they decided, with the FA, of course, another stakeholder, that their mark of respect was for the national game to pause this weekend. And so I think a lot of my view is formed from, and I'm old enough to remember what happened when Lady Diana passed away in tragic circumstances a good few years ago now. I haven't checked this back, but I vividly recall that the games, I think it was the Saturday night that news first broke or was confirmed, and there was Premier League games scheduled on the Sunday. They was postponed. I have a sense that there were other games postponed in the days after that. And for me, it was just the parallel of that's how football responded to another, massively high-profile royal figure in our lives who passed away with quite a sudden, different circumstances, obviously, but nevertheless still unleashed a seismic impact on the population. So I think that's probably a lot of where my opinion on this matter has been formed from, was what happened, previously in terms of the reaction of the footballing authorities to Lady Diana. But by no manner of means would I say Hooks is wrong. If the games had gone ahead, I could see that as well, and for the reasons that he states as well. And we saw, I've seen footage today at the cricket. God save the King, as it was now. Now that was observed, and West Ham Thursday night, those games went ahead, and Manchester United, the European action, and again the reaction of the crowds at those two games. So I certainly would have had no issue whatsoever if we were at Burnley Friday night, or more equitably somewhere on a Saturday afternoon covering Norwich City in the Championship. But the fact that the decision was made, and that was the decision, I have no issue with it at all. As I said earlier, for me, it's moving forward now. It's the midweek cycle coming up, and then next weekend, if those games start getting postponed, I think I'd probably have a different view, if I'm honest, unless there are factors completely out of the control of the national game and the stakeholders in the game, i.e., as we keep hearing that potentially the demands of the police force around the funeral Monday week dictate that major sporting events can't go ahead, or major events per se that would require a police presence. So if that is the case, then of course we'll have to respect that. But I'd have a bigger issue with the upcoming round of games if they're similarly postponed.
Yeah, I've got to be honest. I have no real hard and fast opinion on the postponement. I can kind of see both sides. I can understand people who maybe wanted the games this weekend to be played. I can equally understand why they weren't. I also think that football wouldn't have been able to win whatever decision it kind of took, because if they would have played the games, I think there would have been quite a large faction of people, and probably public as well, looking at it and maybe suggesting that football was out of touch with maybe how the country was feeling at this moment in time, as you said, 24 hours after the news had been confirmed. But also, if the fact they haven't played, I think you've probably got a faction of people who maybe who aren't affected in the same way as others, looking at it and saying, well, actually, we'd just like to kind of crack on with stuff. And that escapism point that I mentioned earlier, and all of the stuff that Hux references in his tweet, it's I can kind of see both, and I don't really say I'm not really in either camp, to be honest. I'm probably sort of on the outside observing the conversation as it's going on, without really maybe having a major view. What I would say is there's a good piece on My Football Writer that Kathy Blake has written today. She's part of the Canaries Trust, but the headline is pretty good, so I'll just read that. It says EFL games can be rearranged. The events of September 2022 cannot, which is quite an interesting way of summing it up, I thought. Sam, what's your view on this, and maybe football going ahead or not going ahead? What's your take on it? I think obviously Hux's tweet got a lot of engagement and a lot of responses, again from both sides. Where do you sit, if at all, on this particular debate?
Yeah, I'm the same really, in terms of seeing both sides, because it's very easy to sit here and talk about how offended people could have been and how upsetting it could have been, and that's absolutely true. Now I will talk more about that in a minute, but I do remember, not too long ago for me now, probably 5-6 years ago, I was of an age where, and I didn't live near Norwich, but I was a big Norwich fan. And if I'd had tickets to go to a game, which was, fairly rare, and I then found out that game was going to be postponed, I would have been absolutely gutted. So I'm not trying to, I'm not going to play down how some people will feel about their escape. And for, I think probably most football fans, the highlight of their week being postponed. But you look at it another way, and when you're making that decision to, as you said, you're going to upset one group of people, right? There are people that would have wanted the game to happen and people that didn't. And is it more offensive to cancel or postpone a football game and have people miss out on that, or to play a football game in an atmosphere where somebody who's very close to a lot of people's hearts has passed away? And I think when you look at it in those terms, it's a pretty easy decision to make in terms of what's going to upset people the least. And if you look at it, and football hadn't postponed and then all the other sports had done, it would have looked incredibly poor on whoever had made that decision, I think. And the reputation of football in society is such that I think there would have been a sentiment of, oh, well, of course, that's what football is and that's what football fans are. And I'm not saying I agree with that sentiment, but I think there is a bit of a perception around the sport that there maybe isn't around others that probably hasn't helped them out in this situation. So I think they probably, for the sake of the sport and the organisations involved in it, they've taken the right decision. And, that's looking at it from quite a cynical point of view. I also think there obviously will be people grieving and people upset. And in the sort of atmosphere that we're in, well, now as well, but especially a day or so ago, they probably have taken the safe decision. So, I can see both sides of it, as you said, and it's easy to now say that I'm sort of sitting on the fence, but it's just one of those things where it's very much down to personal opinion, and either way you upset somebody, so you can't really say that they've got it right or wrong, because it could have gone either way. I totally take Hux's point, and I agree with some of it, and I do think there could have been a way, and maybe that's the only way you see a compromise, is that if they went all out on the tributes and really made it known that they were totally respectful of it, then perhaps it could have been done in the right way. But that's taking a chance, and that's taking risks where they had the option to not do that, and that's the one that they took, and I totally understand that.
Look, it's easy, isn't it, to bash the kind of governing bodies in this situation, I think, for a decision made. But I also think this is something that's happened. Well, it's the first time in 70 years that this has happened. That's almost generational. That's a once in a generation event that we're in at this moment in time. The kind of proximity to the weekend as well, in terms of how close it was before those matches were going to be played. Let's be honest, there's a lot of other things probably that are easier to criticise. The Premier League over, the FA over, the EFL over. This, I think it's a little bit harsh to throw it for them. If it would have happened on a Tuesday or Wednesday, for example, and then you've got maybe a day or two to kind of assess the situation, they weren't really afforded that in this circumstance. So I think they've probably had to make a quick decision and then stick by that decision, which they've obviously done. And as Paddy said, the sports that have continued, the test match today, for example, the players walked out to complete silence. It was really poignant. I felt, obviously we had the kind of amended national anthem, God Save the King, and that was an emotional moment as well. So there are different ways of doing it. Different sports have gone down different routes, and that's obviously the decision we've taken. I guess, Pat, as kind of you've alluded to on a couple of occasions now, the focus turns to the next two rounds of fixtures. Norwich City's next game in the Championship is due to be Wednesday night. Norwich released a statement it was kind of a mini statement on top of the EFL statement, suggesting that they expected games in midweek to go ahead. I was watching Sky Sports News earlier today. There have been obviously other reports across this weekend that have some reporting different things, I think, as the nature of the decision-making process is at this moment in time. But Sky were essentially reporting that some games may go ahead, some games might not. It's going to be kind of a case-by-case basis based on kind of external factors, policing probably being a major one because of various events that are going on in the country over the next few days. And then, of course, next weekend, Norwich are due again at Carrow Road to play West Brom. The funeral for her Majesty Queen Elizabeth has obviously been confirmed for next Monday. So that again creates some issues potentially around policing having to be in the capital, etc. So there's probably some doubt around that fixture as well. I think that one's probably the one people are looking at maybe with a little bit more uncertainty at this moment in time. But of course that may change over the next few days or so upon any EFL update. But what is your kind of thought process on the next two games in terms of where we are? Because from where we are right now, it feels more likely to me that we'll see Norwich City in action again on Wednesday, probably then not next weekend. That's how it feels to me at the moment, and I could be wrong.
Well, it's basically a guessing game at the minute, Connor, and it's stitching together various reports, which I'm sure can change by the hour in this kind of environment. I wouldn't disagree with that assessment. I think midweek fixtures coming up, Norwich's statement, the tone of it. I thought the actual wording of it, I think it said something about recommencement of fixtures from the Tuesday onwards. There's fixtures obviously on the Tuesday, scheduled fixtures. Norwich's is Wednesday night, Bristol City at Carrow Road. What I'm doing now is just scrolling, because the issue I would have for the West Brom game, if that's to be postponed the weekend, essentially the weekend of the funeral, albeit that's going to be on the Monday, is that preceding that is the international break. So Norwich, if they don't play against West Brom, October the 1st, trip to Blackpool. We're on the 10th of September as we record this. So, that in itself, whether that'll be a factor, I don't know, in terms of if the football authorities have any leverage that they can bring to bear if the negotiations are centering around games potentially not going ahead this coming weekend, is that off the back of that is an international shutdown essentially for the clubs. And that, in what is a World Cup season, unless we forget, with already a month-long pause factored in, and then you overlay that it's the Championship and it's 46 games and precious few days in the calendar left, that you begin to see some of the complicating factors, and that's again purely in the rather inconsequential nature of football and professional football, and trying to work around potential issues that may come to pass. But as I said, if essentially police say they're not able to cover footballing events this coming weekend, then the decision's made. The footballing authorities will not be able to proceed. So really, the answer is probably, or the outcome will hinge on, what police forces around the country are able to do, and whether it'll be a geographical, patchwork quilt of certain forces will say no, we can, even if we're required to send resource to the capital for the funeral, we can still man footballing events in our patches. Then I would see no issue with games proceeding, rather than a blanket. The whole programme goes as it has done this current weekend, and then of course we'll see what that means in terms of Norfolk's finest, and whether those discussions. I'll be amazed if those discussions, even at an exploratory level, haven't already started with the football club, the relevant people at the football club, because they'd be remiss not to be scenario planning in that regard for these, certainly the weekend coming, but first and foremost Bristol City. But we'll just have to wait and see. There's no real point in speculating, is there? Ultimately, the games will either be on or they'll be off, and at the minute, the expectation is that the midweek programme will be on. And ultimately, I think the funeral date has only really been confirmed today, Saturday. So it's going to take a few days yet, I think, for that to be worked through now, and for all the relevant stakeholders to get together and discuss what that in practical terms means for other major events scheduled to take place this coming weekend now. So, until we get to that point, might even be middle of the week, and we're still waiting for clarity on that one. But as we sit here on Saturday afternoon, I'm fully expecting to be at Carrow Road Wednesday evening for the visit of Bristol City.
Yes, absolutely. Just finally, before we kind of move away on to other matters, I just want to say it's been really good to see various football clubs donating, obviously, food that they would have had for games this weekend to various local organisations and community groups and food banks as well. That's been good and is a sign. Maybe it gets missed amid all kind of what Sam said earlier about the perception of football perhaps more widely, but shows the good that football clubs can do in their community. So that was good to see, just to end on that. If we shift back to kind of football matters, I suppose, in the traditional sense, Sam, which is probably a bit more kind of home turf for us, really. Milo Rashica's loan move to Galatasaray, I don't actually think it's been officially confirmed by Norwich yet. I think probably lost in the news cycle that we're in, but he has joined Galatasaray, and that's been confirmed at their end. We were expecting this to go through. Dean Smith confirmed at Thursday's press conference it would go through and explained why it was going to go through as well. We've obviously done a piece on the app today, kind of all of us giving our thoughts on why it hasn't gone right for him, or why it hasn't worked out in perhaps the way it was it was hoped, certainly for a player of his caliber and CV and the transfer fee that Norwich City paid for him. What do you make of this decision to let him go out on loan at this stage, where in the last few weeks he's been omitted from matchday squads, and it feels like other players have kind of clawed their way above him in the pecking order?
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and the fact that I feel that way shows how rapidly he's sort of fallen down the pecking order, really. Because remember the start of the season, even that Cardiff game, I thought, despite him being not particularly impressive, I thought he's a really good level player, and he could well rip up the Championship. But I think you see it. There are certain types of performances where you can tell this is going to be a long-term problem, maybe more than with other performances. And I think I don't want to say attitude that we've seen in his matches, because I don't think it's sort of over laziness or lack of hard work, but you just get that sort of vibe off his performances so far this season, that he wasn't particularly happy being there. He didn't see himself spending the season in the Championship, and I think for that reason it works for all parties, really. The fact is, he's played in the Bundesliga for a number of years. He was courted by the likes of Liverpool and Aston Villa, and when he signed for Norwich, I think the understanding among everyone that saw that signing was very much, if Norwich go down, he won't be going down with them. So as soon as they went down, it felt like a little bit of an inevitability. But obviously the lack of interest was certainly something that I think surprised the football club and also surprised the wider fan base. But then when you look at it and try and find the reasons, Norwich were relegated with 22 points. He scored 1 league goal. I think he got 2 assists, and I think 1 or 2 of them might have been from corners as well. So he didn't have a great season personally. The only reason Norwich were able to get him in the first place was because he'd struggled with injuries and poor form at Werder Bremen, who had been relegated the season before. So we're actually looking at one of those players now who, and you see them all across football now. There's the likes of Dele Alli. I think Todd Cantwell was in that sort of pattern at the start of the season. He's one of those footballers now that's trying to resurrect form that he's shown previously, and clubs are now looking at him as a player who they know has got it within them, but they need to find it from somewhere. And unfortunately for Norwich, they just weren't able to do that. But you look at it another way, and had he not shown those sorts of weaknesses in his final year at Werder Bremen, would they have been able to get him in the first place? Would he have been so cheap? And had they maybe splashed £15 million on him, which admittedly was unlikely, but let's say they had, they'd now be in a much worse financial position. So it's not all bad. I think it felt relatively inevitable once they got relegated, and these sorts of loan moves, I think we see them across football now, that the market is quite deflated, obviously, other than the sort of Premier League level. And I've written a piece that's just gone out on the app for more on that. But elsewhere across the football world, the market is pretty deflated, and clubs aren't wanting to commit sums. So I never saw Rashica leaving for the amount that Norwich paid for him, to be honest. And I think this was what we could all see coming from a long way away. And it is a shame, because he's clearly a very talented player. And if he had found a way to make it work at Norwich, and Norwich had found a way to make it work, I think he could have been ripping up the Championship now. As it is, other players have stepped up and taken their opportunity, and it doesn't look like Norwich will miss him. We know how football fans are, and it could be that in 3 months, if they lose a couple of games in a row, people will be calling to have him back. But he certainly hasn't done too much to get goodwill with Norwich fans. And from the response to our coverage of his transfer, I don't think there are too many heartbroken supporters of a yellow and green persuasion at the moment over the deal. So overall, it's one of those ones, a little bit like Pielis Melu. Good deal for all parties, and I don't think anybody's particularly upset about that. One to probably revisit in a year or so, because you can be sure Stuart Webber isn't going to want to cut his losses on that transfer outlay.
Yeah, what was it? One league goal and 2 assists, I think, one of which was this season teeing up Max Aarons to score against Wigan. It's not good enough, is it, for a player that Norwich City shelled out nearly £9 million for, which is among obviously the biggest transfers that the club has made in its history. So, and I think it would have been if various add-ons would have been activated. So, just not a good enough return. I totally get what you mean. There was kind of a disinterest around, not maybe disinterested, a little bit harsh, but he looked like a player who maybe wanted to be elsewhere. I think that's probably a better way of saying it, particularly at Hull, where he just looked like the body was willing, but the mind wasn't really there. It didn't feel like. And we've obviously had some quotes from Pierre Lees-Malou today, Saturday, as we're recording, speaking about how pretty much when Norwich were relegated, it became clear to him that he wanted to move on. I think it's probably the same with Milo Rashica, and Dean Smith has alluded to that as well in kind of some of the statements that he's made when he's been asked about him over the last month or so, saying that he was signed as a Premier League player and expected to be playing at that level. And that adjustment to a lower level of football, which is more intense, more physical, games are relentless, can be quite tough for some players, and also players that maybe you'd look at and go, yep, those ones should excel at this level. One thing that Galatasaray have confirmed is the amount of money they'll be spending on his wages. So that's 1.3 million, I think, of English pounds, which works out to, I think, just over 27,000 a week, which is interesting. It's not usually a detail that we get given with transfers. Probably the difference in terms of the Turkish market compared to Norwich and how they're perceived, England, and how they're perceived. Galatasaray also signed Juan Mata, Maro Arcadi as well. So they've signed a fair few names this summer. They didn't win the Turkish title last year, so we'll obviously be keeping an eye on Milo Rashica's interest. But Pad, more broadly, I mean, it's interesting kind of the time that we're talking about this, but his arrival, as I said, had the potential, similarly to Christos Solis, who also departed the club on loan this summer, to be a club record transfer eventually, if various things worked out. Those two deals have probably done little for the perception, rightly or wrongly, that some Norwich City fans have, that when the football clubs spend money on players, Ricky van Wolfswinkel, Leroy Fer, Stephen Naismith, I think it's probably a bit harsh to throw Tim closer in that bracket. I'm sure some will. Now Milo Rashica, Christos Solis, people would have put Josh Sargent probably in that bracket before the last 2 months or so. When Norwich City spend money relative to themselves, it doesn't feel like it particularly goes well. I mean, the last player who really came in for big money in terms of Norwich City that perhaps succeeded is probably Dean Ashton. Is that fair?
Oh, you put me on the spot there, Conrad. That's a lot of transfers in the intervening period. I'm sure there's a few.
Alex Pritchard, maybe.
Yeah, well,
made a profit.
Was a success?
No, I wouldn't label him a success.
I would.
No. Good player, but it just didn't do it, did he? After a period of time, probably that injury at Cambridge did for him. To be honest,
I tell you what I'll do. While you're talking, I'll get a list up of Norwich City's transfer fees, and I go through them, and we can maybe see if there are any green light ones in there.
I mean, certainly Rashica would be in the debit column, spanning multiple club regimes and sporting directors / chief exec types. But you also made a good point. Josh Sargent 2 months ago is in the debit column, and look at him now. And I think that was the hope with Rashica, that at a lower level he would rip it up, for want of a better phrase. And I remember distinctly asking Dean Smith post probably Lees-Malou's exit, because we know that Dean Smith sat every player down at the end of last season and gave his thoughts unvarnished and told them where he fitted into his plans, and wanted to hear what they felt as well. Conversely, Lees-Malou was very clear that the championship wasn't for him. But Dean Smith, when I did put that to him, said, no, he's come back. There's no issues at all. He talked about his body fat and, physically he was in a better shape, he felt, during pre-season. Absolutely no issues with the guy not wanting to be here. But his performances, or lack of, on the pitch didn't show me, anyway, that was the case. So he didn't fancy the championship. It's quite clear. Dean Smith clearly doesn't fancy him right here, right now. If you're not even making a match day squad, let alone an 11, the game is up. And it was no surprise to me that eventually, when we were saying it from pretty much the end of last season, that him and Jolis, that they probably wouldn't be here. Obviously, when the domestic window closed and then the main European leagues, you felt like that was his opportunity gone. But probably pays just to see what other leagues open slightly longer. In Turkey, they certainly like a high profile signing, that is for sure. And I think Mata and Icardi's days are behind them. The best days are behind them. But it's quite a statement from the 22-time champions of that country, no less. In Turkey, they are a massive, massive club, serial European playing seasons as well. So they have a lot of cachet, and if he goes and has a good season, then I think that'll, at the very least, I think probably his bridges are burnt here with Norwich, but at the very least, it should inflate his value on the market, that they may be able to recoup some of. Unlikely, I think they get all of that money back unless he has a wow of a season in Turkey, but that will clearly be the hope. They're obviously not going to say that. Dean Smith parting shot was still like he packaged it with Zolis, they'll come back. They're still under contract, and if they've performed, and to be fair, he brought Sinani, he brought Hernandez back into the fold. I know they were not originally out on his watch. That was Daniel Farker, but there was 2 returning loan players he looked at, liked to look at, and has brought them into the fold. So it isn't beyond the realms, but it probably hinges, I think, on Norwich's league status. If Norwich are in the Championship again next season, Rashica isn't coming back to play in the Championship because he didn't fancy it this time around. So I think the best exit strategy now is he has a good season in Turkey. That puts him in the shop window, and there's a club willing to pay as much of the initial outlay Norwich splashed on him last summer. But it's sad, really, because I think there is a player there, and you look at his body of work in the Bundesliga. Maybe, as I wrote in that piece you referenced, maybe it's just, it's the wrong time, the wrong league, the wrong club, because there's clearly a player of some ability. You look at his career thus far, and the clubs he was linked with when his star was really on the rise in the Bundesliga, bigger clubs than Norwich, let's be honest. He now finds himself unable to make it at Norwich and gone out on loan to Turkey. So he needs to get a hold of his career and start pointing it in the right direction again. Otherwise, he's not going to fulfill his talent. And he's 26. He's not a 21-year-old. The clock is ticking. So be interesting from afar to watch how he gets on. Zolis is a different kettle of fish because of his age and because, he was very raw when he arrived at Norwich. If he has a good season in Holland, then maybe still a future for him at Carrow Road. But I think Rashica is game over, basically. It's just how it ends now.
Yeah, I would agree. We've gone on off on a fun little tangent. So what I've got here is the list of it's all of Norwich City's kind of record transfers, I suppose. But we'll limit it to the top 10, and I'm gonna just chuck the names at you, and you can both give me a yes or a no as to how successful you think they've been. There's probably 1 or 2 in there that may be too early to say. So we'll go yes, no, or too soon to say, and we'll do it that way. This is according to Transfer Markt, so I'm not going to read the fees, but this is just obviously they're probably broadly right in terms of the sums of money that Norwich have paid for them and where they rank. They're maybe just not necessarily in the right order. Yannick Vilska is 11, so 11th according to this list. So we'll give him an honourable mention. That one wasn't successful. Yannick actually sat down with Yannick. I think there's an interview on the app with him about his time at Norwich City, which you can go and read because he was very honest about maybe why it didn't work out. Right, let's start with Ben Gibson. Paddy, yes, no, too soon to tell?
No.
Sam?
No.
Alex Pritchard, Pad?
No.
Yes.
Sam?
Yeah,
yes.
I think they made a profit, so fair dues.
Very true. Josh Sargent, Pad?
Too soon to say now. Too soon to say, but he's tracking towards the yes column, that's for sure.
Yeah, same. I think if he carries on, he's worth that in the Championship these days.
This one's interesting. Robbie Brady?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent play.
And made a profit again.
Ricky Van Wolfswinkel? Pad?
Disaster.
Yeah, quite a fat no from me.
Gabriel Sara's 5th, so I think he's definitely the too soon to say column. Tim Closer in 4th. Pad?
Yes. Length of service. Length of service. I mean, you're not going to recoup on his age when he arrived at Norwich. You're not going to recoup the money that they paid, but spanned a very turbulent first season under Farker, and he was a major confidant. So, in a roundabout way, injury probably robbed him from seeing that first title win to the end because he was in his side before he got injured. So I think in a very turbulent period under Farker and Webber, he was the glue.
I think he was worth what they paid for about 10 games before that injury in the Premier League in his first season. And then after that, very decent operator, but probably not worth the fee. So
definitely worth it for the Ipswich equaliser alone. Number 3, Stephen Naismith.
Next.
Milo Rashica 2nd. I mean, we've kind of discussed him.
Yeah, it's a no, isn't it?
No.
Sholis is the last one. Which will maybe too soon to tell. So I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, we could look quite silly if we say no and then. But yeah, I don't get the feeling we will, to be honest.
Sorry, Sam. I'd say a bit like Sargent, too soon to say, but different to Sargent. He's tracking in the no column, towards the no column, I think.
Yeah.
He has a major U-turn.
I'd agree with that, actually. Bit safer.
what I'm going to do now, I'm not going to ask you. We're not going to do the same thing, but this is from 11 to 20. I'll just read the names because they're interesting. 11, Yannick, again, according to Transfermarkt, might not be right in terms of fees and where they rank, but all Norwich City signings and all Norwich City, all players that Norwich City paid fees for. Yannick Vilskut is 11th according to list. Demetrius Yanulis 12th. Gary Hooper 13th. Dean Ashton 14th. Angus Gunn 15th. That fee is definitely wrong. So that maybe shows that we should take this with an element of a pinch of salt. Nelson Oliveira in 16th. Leroy First 17th. Fadis Odija Afoe, who has subsequently gone on to play Champions League football since leaving Norwich City. He is 18th according to this list. Carl Lafferty 19th. Sam McCallum 20th. I mean, in terms of that list, there's not too many players that you would say were hits, really. So to kind of look at that and then ask a similar question, Pad, when Norwich City tend to go in the market and spend money big relative to themselves, it doesn't feel like there's a huge amount of success that they've had.
Well, that list is completely to cock because Nathan Redmond should be on there somewhere, surely. And
I can tell you where he is on it, probably.
But he was definitely a success, both in terms of they made money on him, but also, he was a key figure capped by that wonderful team goal in the playoff final in 2015. So where's Nathan Redmond? I demand to know.
44th, right. which is interestingly below Onel Hernandez and Ben Godfrey's from York, which definitely isn't the case. So that goes to show how wrong the list is. But,
I think we've shot ourselves in the foot. I shouldn't have thrown that one in, but we've completely undermined Transfermarkt as a source of some repute there with that.
Well, I think the top 10 are relative. I would say they were relatively right, probably not in the right order. And there's probably maybe some players on the outside who should be in there and probably maybe a couple in there who shouldn't be there. But, as a fun little game, it worked, I think.
Fair enough.
Yeah, well done, mate.
What we'll do now is we'll obviously throw it open to people to listen to the pod, to get in touch with us and make their case. If there's any players that maybe we have mentioned as not be, or I haven't mentioned, but as Pat and Sam have referenced as not being successful that you think have been, or players that they felt were successful that maybe haven't been, and you would like to argue their case or your case as to why maybe the answer is different or why you agree with them, you can, of course, get in touch on our social media channels, or you can email us as well. The PinkUn at archon.co.uk is probably the best address to use since it's shiny and new. I think that is about it, unless you guys have got anything else you want to talk about. What I will mention is Norwich City are hosting on Monday their emergency general meeting with 4 resolutions, of course, surrounding Mark Atanasio. We've spoken about this to death, really. So you can obviously go and read about that and what it all means and what the letters to shareholders are and what the various resolutions do. But obviously we will we'll bring you news of that as it happens. We're not expecting Mark Atanasio to be there. We're not expecting the meeting to be a particularly long one. It is just literally going to be a case of voting on those resolutions. There's going to be no question and answer session as planned anyway at this moment in time. So we'll see what comes from that. But I think the expectation is that Norwich City will have a new board member come probably Tuesday or Wednesday when a bit of paperwork has been sorted out and various bits finalised. So that's going to be very interesting in itself. Of course, we'll bring you all the updates across the next week or so surrounding fixtures as and when they drop, whether they're going to be on, whether they're going to be off. As we sit here right now, we will be at Carrow Road on Wednesday for that game against Bristol City. Of course, you can follow all of our coverage PinkUn.com, but also on the PinkUn Plus app. If you yet to take a trial out for that, you can go to PinkUn.com. There is a tab in the top left that says PinkUn Plus. Click on that, follow all the instructions. You can get a month's free trial in there, not just written content, but video and audio as well, for you to get your eyes and ears on and into as well. Pad, Sam, thank you very much for joining me in what's been a very interesting pod where we've had to talk about maybe issues that we wouldn't really normally talk about or tackle. So as is the state of where we are at this moment in time. Thank you very much for listening as well. I hope you have an enjoyable week. Obviously an interesting situation. I'm sure all of us will be watching, see how it kind of unfolds as we live through a moment in history, which is kind of a very rare thing to have to do. So we'll see what transpires from here. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again very, very soon.